All right, this is the Stonewater Podcast. My name is Woody Hager. I've got Randy Hurtado and Chris Carver with me. We are going through a series called A Problem with God. For the last 2 weeks, we've been putting out on people's lawns and magnets. We've got a website that says, My Problem with God Is, and people have been submitting questions, difficult ones. Randy I think now last Sunday, a week ago, you and Jeremy got up in front of the whole, gave the sermon, and you talked about science and faith. And so that's the topic I wanted to talk about today. But before I do, let's kind of get oriented. So Randy, you gave us a little bit of story about why you got involved in this topic, but dive in. What was the circumstances and why stay in this? Why talk about this? Why what's your interest?
Well, my initial interest was surrounding a situation with my eldest daughter who was in a relationship with a young man that got pretty serious, and through college, they decided that when college was over, they were going to get married, and everything was going real well. He was a great kid. And one day he came to her and confided in him that he had lost his faith in God, that his professors in college had convinced him that God wasn't necessary for us to all be here, that science, as we understand it, explained why we were all here, and that was good enough for him. And he just started throwing things at me. Of course, my daughter asked if I would meet with him, and I heard what his concern was, and I had nothing.
What was an example of one of the questions that you remember him asking?
Well, specifically around evolution, and if, as he understood it through science, that we, the life came into existence on its own about 4 billion years ago, and here we are today through evolutionary process. And of course, I never studied that. The last time I studied that was in high school, and never really even gave it a second thought. In fact, if anything, I was probably just comfortable with the idea that if evolution was true, God probably controlled the process, not realizing the biblical implications of that mind view or that mindset. So it wasn't until delving into apologetics, which our pastor Jeremy White told me about, that I started to realize that this was an entire world of being able to do what 1 Peter 3:15 states we should be able to do, which is to defend our faith.
Yep.
And to be able to not just point to the Bible, but to God's creation itself, to be able to do that. And to this day, I haven't heard an original argument from an atheist that hasn't been refuted in some way, shape, or form. And so hopefully that gives people confidence to know that they can defend their belief.
Reasonably,
yes.
Believe their faith. All right, so Chris, tell us a little about you. And now, just full disclosure is that I heard about you because my wife attended Jeremy and Randy's kind of like
rehearsal.
Yeah. They got in front of the whole ministry team and says, look, we're going to have this. And my wife said, hey, do you know Chris Carver? He was asking all sorts of smart questions. And I thought, no, I don't. But as we've been talking, it's like you're coming from a unique perspective. So tell me why you find such interest in this.
Yeah, so I was raised in the church, degreed electrical engineer. My wife is a meteorologist, so we went to school and we heard from a lot of professors that not necessarily taught against the Bible, but the way the facts, quote unquote facts, were presented didn't really mesh up with what we were raised in. So we had to go through a lot of talking amongst ourselves and with friends and other people about, what is our faith? What do we believe? And then I serve in the Connection Center here. So why I was asked to come view you guys' sermon was to look at through the eyes of a first-time guest, or through the eyes of maybe like a skeptic that's coming in that doesn't have a relationship, doesn't really know, they're just kind of testing out the waters. What would they ask? So between my wife and I, all the physics and science and everything that we took through college really helped us, looking at your sermon, kind of dive deep and ask some of those more challenging questions that I think a lot of people struggle with, because we were in that camp. I won't say left our faith or moved away from that, but a lot of those questions that people have, we had, because we did dive heavy into science and the physics behind how everything works, and so it raised a lot of questions.
So I think it's important before we kind of dive right in. And by the way, I think the purpose of this kind of forum is to ask the questions that somebody would have liked to ask on a Sunday morning, and maybe be able to kind of chase that down to get some sort of reasonable answer. But And we will get to some of these questions. And believe it or not, there wasn't a lot of questions about this. It could be just early in the campaign, but there are some big ones that were hit. I think it's important that as we really kind of define the problem, there is a perception, and I guess I'm wanting to know agreement-wise from you, both of you. There's a perception that the scientific community, the scientific principles and methods and things like that are at odds with faith-based statements in the biblical narrative. And specifically, I'm just talking about Christianity. I know that we can't go down some of these other ones, and I don't want to, but we're talking about the biblical narrative around some of the claims of science and some of the claims of the Bible and where they touch. There's a perception that's a conflict. So the question, I guess, to both of you is that a conflict, or is it just imagined, or why the perception that science has disproven faith?
I'd say that the perception that there's a conflict is a fairly new one in the span of time. It's something that really hasn't taken hold until about the last 70 years. Prior to that, science and religion really didn't conflict at all, and scientists really didn't have a problem with God. And in fact, as I talked about in my talk, scientists who were believers were a lot of who discovered a lot of things that we benefit from today in science. And they didn't get into science to disprove the existence of God, but rather to know him better, to understand how he clicked. And so I do believe in the world today that there is a perception of a conflict, mainly because of the world that we live in today. We've driven God out of school, which is where these kids are learning the evolutionary process. They're not taught that there may be an alternative. They are also not taught that how evolution, when run through the scientific method, which most scientists use to prove hypothesis, doesn't do a very good job. But that's not talked about. It's almost, and in some states, 100% taught as fact. And that's just how it is. Mm-hmm. And so you have a young mind who's being brought up in maybe a Christian home, who's being taught the biblical way, and then they're going to school and being told, no, this is how you were created. And if the parents aren't staying on top of their role in the home, then that mind can be easily persuaded, especially when you consider the implications of it. I mean, if you're living in a world where there is no moral being that is going to judge you ultimately,
or if morality itself is an evolutionary process that society cooks up,
then that makes a really good argument for the person that wants to live in sin, right? That's actually what I've been told by youth that I've worked with in Elevate was, before I truly believed in God, that whole process sounded more appealing because then I didn't have anybody to answer to, so I could live the way I want to. And so it is appealing.
Right. So Chris, what about you? I mean, coming from your point of view, why do you think there's a perception? Why does both sides kind of draw on a battle line, say there's a problem?
So I agree with Randy that the way things are presented are these are the facts. This is how this process works, when in fact they are theories. So you learn about the difference between theories and laws when you go take science and physics and all of that. But once you get into the actual theories, most of the time they are presented as this is what happened.
Because it's the only reasonable explanation with a naturalistic theory.
Correct.
Right?
Correct. And because we have separated the church from the state, they don't teach the biblical side, that version. They just teach the scientific version, which is the accepted, I'll call it scientific conclusion. So a lot of times, I know for myself and my wife, we were left to our own to try to connect the dots. And we, similar to you, we had to go do a lot of research and a lot of praying and a lot of reading of the Bible to really say, hey, these don't really conflict. There can be a lot of, I guess I could say, some gaps that I still need filled in, which is probably what I'm going to try to do today. And just trying to get those two stories to line up. This is what God in the Bible says, and this is what science is working to prove towards, but we still don't know the answers.
So let me, and before we go into the questions, maybe this is helpful for us and to move ahead. science and faith should overlap, but there's some clear boundaries. For example, I think science to some degree, or this, the rationalistic philosophy that all things can be explained through natural phenomenon has moved into faith and started making faith-based claims, things that they can't and shouldn't know. Right. But I think the opposite is also true, that Christians now begin to dictate science where maybe the Bible doesn't necessarily say that. Right. So I guess in our framing of this problem between science and faith, what is the line that we as Christians shouldn't cross as we look at science? And likewise, as a skeptic or somebody who's coming from that atheistic or naturalistic framework, shouldn't move into the areas of faith. Where do you think that line should be?
Right. So I think the atheistic model is to be arrogant to say that they can explain things that they clearly can't.
Humility that they can't explain everything, yet
right.
They want to.
And where you're referring to as faith, whereas if we're pointing back to the Bible, the Christian is okay with not being able to explain everything, because Deuteronomy 29:29 clearly states that there are secret things God won't reveal to us.
Or we don't have the capacity to understand even if it was explained.
And if we could, I heard it put well by a Christian apologist one time, that if I can fit God into my 8-pound brain, then he's not a God worth worshiping.
Right.
And so to be able to explain God, that's okay for a Christian to say, I don't know. It's not okay in the atheistic mindset to say, I don't know, because it admits defeat, but it also gives an escape hatch for them, for the Christian to say, well, then there is a possibility. Yeah. And they don't like that.
Yeah.
They don't want to hear that there's a chance. You can take most atheists to agnostic in one question or in one statement, to say that science says that there are no absolutes, correct? And they say yes. Okay, so you absolutely can't say that there is no God.
Right.
Well, yeah. Okay, so you're an agnostic. You're not an atheist. And in fact, the Bible in Romans 1:20 clearly states that there are no atheists, because it says that
creation is
all of creation knows, they're
right.
perceived, so that they will be without excuse. So God's word is telling us there are no atheists. There are people that decide to completely deny God and put their faith in a man-studied science. Mm-hmm. And then where they can't fill the gaps, they come up with theories that just don't make sense at all.
Or they're unbelievable theories.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
But they're still
that would require just as much of a miracle as Christians claim.
And just probably just as much faith at the same time. Okay,
Absolutely.
So what about, Chris, where does that line, and I'm trying to think about, this is on both sides,
Mm-hmm.
So you have people of faith over here that maybe don't know science, and people over here science that don't have any idea what faith really is. How do we protect to make sure that we don't overstep bounds in both directions? What would you think?
So I would think the line has to be in those areas that we call theories, right? So we've come up with scientific theories, which is exactly what they are. Someone somewhere has come up with, maybe this is some way we could explain this. And so for me, what my wife and I have to do is we look at what the Bible says, and then does this theory line up with that, or does it not line up with that? So in that theory space, when you're trying to fill in the blanks, that's really what I would call for us, I'm not going to call it a hard line, but that gray area where you have to be careful, right? So you have science over here that explains things, laws of gravity, when I drop something, it's going to drop, right? So that you can explain, and then you have the story of creation in the Bible, and God says this is what happened and this is how I did it, right? So when you start trying to blend those two together in that theory space, that's really where I think the line has to be drawn, of, hey, you know what, maybe this is the area where I don't know the answer, and I'm not going to know the answer until I get to heaven and I get to ask. Those areas where you have to be careful and just truly understand what a theory is, and that it is a theory. It's someone trying to explain what God did as a miracle, which cannot be explained using what we know over here on the science realm, using the laws of physics.
There's a I guess a well-known human behavior that if we hear something over and over and over again, repetition, that we become familiar with it, and that familiarity kind of breeds this truth.
It's called cognitive dissonance.
Yeah. So, part of this is that just because you've heard it over and over and over again doesn't necessarily make it truth. Truth is evaluated both in the scientific community and biblically through some sort of foundation. the scientific method provides a basis for truth. You can't step beyond that scientific method and make claims outside of it. Likewise, a Christian looking at the Bible cannot say, I'm going to claim truth that the Bible doesn't explicitly say. We have measures for truth on both sides. All right, great intro. We've talked about it. Faith, science, where this boundary is. So let's the only questions that I have from the submitted, and this is from skeptics and people alike, man, the big thing is creation. It's Genesis 1, in the beginning God created, and he did, it did take 7 days, 6 days of creation.
Right.
And very quickly he tells how God says, here's the story, this is how I did it, and then immediately jumps to Adam and Eve. So the two biggest questions that we have so far is, the problem I have with God is, the creation account, 6 days, really? That's a lot. The universe and everything in it, 6 days? Wow, that doesn't seem reasonable. And the other part is, wait up, Adam and Eve, fully formed human beings, cognitive, sentient, moral beings that just appeared on the scene. One of the questions that we had was, it was theological, but I'll give you an example, was that, so in the Bible it says that Adam and Eve's sin brought death. But the dinosaurs, if they existed before the Adam and Eve, they were killing each other for millions of years. So there's this, you have this hodgepodge of we don't understand how that worked. And there's a lot of that, because it's some things that, like you said, we just don't know. We don't know how God did it. This is what he told us, and this is what we're basing it as truth. How do we help the Christian walk through that creation story in a way that breathes confidence, says, okay, we're not believing in something that's unreasonable here. So walk us through creation and Adam and Eve too, which is, I think, kind of connected, but it's also very much different. How would you guys explain that as a Christian if I came to you and said, all right, I believe Jesus and all this, but this creation stuff, I can't buy it. What would you say?
Well, I would say that, because it directly ties into the answer, that evolution, in my opinion, is the best. If you were the opposition of God, and you wanted to completely wipe out all three Abrahamic religions, evolution is the perfect nail on the head, because
it strikes at the root.
It strikes at the root. If a single cell organism created in an open system is the reason why we're all here today through evolution, then the creation account is invalid. Adam and Eve never sinned. There is no sin nature, and Christ had no reason to return.
The whole story falls
completely fall apart.
Right.
Now, I've never heard that, the theory that dinosaurs existed before a creation account, because the word creation literally is that the creation story in the 6 days literally talks about how God created this whole place from the beginning. In the beginning is the alpha, the beginning. Mm-hmm. And so it wasn't in the beginning. Oh, by the way, beginning means 65 million years after God created dinosaurs. In the beginning. It says in the beginning. So God created, and in fact, I read once, scientists have actually concluded that, and even scientists that don't necessarily believe in God, that if they had to create a universe and world-like structure that we have, that they would have to actually create it in the way that it was listed.
Yeah, the creation account is very
scientific.
Yeah, it's like first matter, first light.
You couldn't do what was created on day 4 before day 1 was here. All the preceding days had to have happened in that order for,
and that's
ultimately
that's pretty divergent from other religious creationist stories where it came out of thin air. It's like God's really saying, almost like he's helping us explain the laws of the universe.
Right.
You must have this to make this, to make this, to
and
make this.
when I heard the question, or the term reasonable, come out of the question, based on what? We're posturing that human reasoning is what we're basing that off of. But you're talking about the creator of everything here.
Right.
Why can't the creator of everything do what he did in one day, and then on day 2 do what he did in one day? The concept of God creating man out of thin or out of dirt, fully formed.
Why can't he?
That's actually the biggest argument for why, we have it within the Christian community, old earth versus young earth. I'm a young Earth creationist, so I personally I look at the Earth and its appearance of age and say, well, if God can create Adam fully formed with age as a man, then why can't He create the Earth that with the appearance of age as well? We do know that the geological columns, when that whole concept is looked at closely, falls apart on itself, because you have so much circular reasoning in that. The fossils date the column, and the column
in turn
dates the
dates
fossils, and
yeah.
so you're going, well, hold on a second.
It
Too
was a
much circular
theory that
reasoning
was
there.
built upon, and now it's...
And it was
yeah.
clearly created, if you look back to its origin, by somebody who followed Charles Darwin's mindset and went, well, if that happened, then we should be able to come up with a reason why it's true. Because Charles Darwin even said in his book that I would expect, though I don't expect to find him in my lifetime, and I'm ad-libbing here, but that if my theory is true, then the fossil record should show transitional fossils, and surely they will be found in the future.
Right.
Yet when we talked about it the other day, there hasn't been one found in all of archaeology there, so
let me ask, what problems do you think the skeptic coming into our church has with creation?
So I was going to say, with the older Earth versus young Earth kind of argument, you threw those terms out there. I think that's the problem that a lot of skeptics have, is science, the way we look at science, would say to support more of the old Earth. Earth has been around for 4.5 billion years.
Sure.
So and then a lot of Christians would come in and say, and quote it, a day to us, or a day to God is 1,000 years.
theory.
The day age, yeah.
Yeah. So what would you say to that argument? And I think what I'm trying to ask you to do is just explain a little bit more about old Earth versus young Earth.
Well, and this is, again, I don't get too far off topic, because this is an argument within the Christian community
Right.
more than it is. But it is one that a skeptic or somebody on the fence could bring up. How I would explain that is, if you look at the creation account on what happened on day 1, what happened on day 2, eventually life comes into form before day 6, right? So my answer to that would be, in order for death to have actually, because you need death for things to start eating each other, right?
That's
So
one of the
that
questions here, yeah.
Right. And so, and I'd have to look at the days, but life existed, the beasts of the field and stuff, before man did. So are you saying these things didn't eat for millions of years? That's what my argument to that would be. If a day equals a million years, so these things, it just doesn't work. That's us trying to use human reasoning based off of what science has told us, using carbon-14 dating and potassium argon dating and all the different methods, which on their own fall apart because they require so much assumption. Carbon-14 requiring that how much carbon-14 was present to begin with, because the way that they determine the age of it is how much is present, how much when they test the age of that thing. Well, you're saying, if I heard it once put, if you walk into a room and a candle's burning, can you tell me when the candle was lit? Can you tell me how tall it was before you got there? There's so many things we can't know, yet it fits the worldview perfect on millions of years, so let's just go with that. But it's not scientific. And they'll even admit it. If you get to the depth of it, they'll admit, this is also theoretical.
They'll give you a plus or minus 2 million years.
Right. But they've even tested, I think we talked about it in one of the services, where they've tested an actual animal in the ground, and one side of its body tested at so many millions, and the other side millions of years more. Live snails being tested at 25,000 years old. I mean, these things that are still alive. So it just comes down to, what are you basing it off of? People have a problem with that, because they're basing it off of what they've learned in their lifetime and what's being presented to them in school and further education. But
so as a skeptic, and I'm asking these questions, if I don't believe, let's say I choose to believe that in what we call the old Earth theory, does that affect whether or not I'm a Christian, going to heaven?
I think that it will definitely create more conversation when you are trying to witness to somebody who does have a problem with that, because obviously if you just look at the biblical timeline, there's not millions of years in the book in the
Right.
Bible. So, but I don't think that, and I would even say, and I said it kind of at the closing of every service last week, is you don't have to know every answer that was given up here. You just have to know there is an answer. And so, is every Christian going to be going out to disciple and to evangelize with apologetics on their mind? No. God is enough. Let's make that abundantly clear. Jesus is enough. But when this conversation comes up, it's not a bad idea to know there are answers to this so that you don't feel ill-prepared to say, you know what, I've heard this talk before, and I remember there was a reasonable argument for that. I just don't recall what it was.
I think it's introducing. It's the like what you said at the very beginning, is that the scientific community has a problem with being humble. You know, they think that they can explain everything, and I think part of this whole talk and going into really looking at science and faith is to say, hey, we're introducing a reasonable doubt for the way things have always been explained.
Right.
And in that gap, I just want the chance to say, all right, you know, there's a reasonable doubt that this didn't happen this way.
Right.
What are we left with? We're left with what God says.
Right. There's an old saying out there that says, and I'm terrible at quoting individuals, I'll capture something in my memory and that's what I'll stick to. So, but it says, scientists for hundreds of years scaled this mountain of intellect.
That was
only
Ravi
to
Zacharias. Yeah, he mentioned it.
Well, he mentioned it, but
he
about
was,
somebody else.
Yeah.
And he states that, and they finally crest the top of the mountain to find that theologians have been there all along.
Yeah.
You know, we're not making a statement. You know, science wants to say that they absolutely know, which kind of violates their whole concept, but that they know that science will explain something eventually, and we're saying God, and we can't explain him because he's God.
Right.
But we won't just leave it like that. You know, you don't want to be so blind to what you can see in front of you and experience in science and what have you. But Christianity is not anti-science.
So to that point, and I'd love to hear you guys talk on this, is that, you know, I think there's a stereotype, and we need to talk about the stereotype that somehow if you're a person of faith that you're anti-science.
Yeah.
So what do we accept? You know, as we sit there, it's like, so, okay, science says that. You know, we talked about the Bible and everything else. And I guess what I'm asking is that well, hold on. Let's back up a little bit. Skeptics coming in the church having issues. Chris, give me a chance to formulate this thought here before I say it. What other issues do you think are going to come in besides just the creation story, old earth and new earth? What other skeptical questions do you think are going to be brought in?
We didn't really talk about in our discussion Adam and Eve and about how, so they asked the question, okay, so Adam and Eve, they say they lived to be 900 something years old, right? So how does that work? And you kind of talked about it in the sermon, but
one of the services, I don't think we got to it.
Yeah, so science would say that our physical bodies are not capable of living that long. Yet the Bible, the whole book of Genesis, has stories of these individuals living to be hundreds of years old
up until until Noah.
Correct.
So from a scientific standpoint, when the story of Noah happened, the earth was the environment was completely changed by the flood, by the waters of the deep coming up, and water from the top, from the heavens coming down and churning everything up, killing everything. What we do see in science is they have discovered, and I think I talked about in one of the services, the oxygen saturation was much higher, purer. In what we do know from a scientific standpoint is when, one, we have to remember that Adam and Eve and their lineage were the first, so their bodies were the most pure. Like, we know in science that we're constantly getting worse with time. I'm passing down bad traits and genes to my kids.
You're right.
We're breaking down. Yeah, we're
right.
breaking down ultimately. We're not as strong like Adam and Eve. They were the superhuman, and then we just get worse with time. Entropy, the second law of thermodynamics, proves that, right? So that's scientific. But the Christian doesn't have a problem with somebody living 900 years, as it also doesn't have a problem with an animal that is the size of a lizard growing to the size of a bus living 900 years.
With a nostril the size of a quarter. Yeah.
Right. Because the oxygen saturation was so high that it was conducive, it allowed for life. I mean, if we took the story of from the Bible out of it and just asked scientifically if our environment was different than it is today with how much oxygen is in the air and everything, I think it's like 13% or something. Would things live longer? Would things grow bigger? I mean, why we find today what we find a leaf on a tree that's this size, we find giant versions of it that could be our bedspread. It's because of how the environment was back then versus what it is now and how much it changed in the flood. And that's why man started to live fewer and fewer years as the environment continued to change into what it is today, where now man lives to about 100 years or a little bit over 100 years. But if you follow the Bible, you'll see Noah, I think he was 400, but then you'll slowly start to see age fall off, and that's consistent with what we would understand about an environment that's slowly changed because of a massive flood worldwide.
All right, so I'm gonna kind of back up. I was gonna ask a different question, but we're kind of coming up to a time part here.
Yeah.
This is a different kind of line of question, and I think this is a more personal, because we've talked about ideas. We talked about, what science has to say, what faith has to say, but I'm interested to see what you guys say about this. What is and this is for both of you to answer, what is your biggest problem? Like when you look at the narrative account, with the biblical narrative account, when you look at creation, when you look at Adam and Eve, you look at all that, is there just this, hey, I really trip up on this, I believe God, but this is the part for me that's just hard to believe? In other words, this idea that we want to accept everything on faith, but this is, my reason just keeps my human reason keeps tripping over this. And I'd like to know from both of you, like, what are those big challenges for you as you look back on the biblical narrative and kind of like, that's hard for me to swallow, but I'm trusting God with it. What would you guys say to that?
On that one?
So my wife and I both struggled with the creation story because we did learn so much about dinosaurs. Growing up in Granbury, we had Dinosaur Valley right down the street, and dinosaurs lived billions of years ago, millions of years ago, whatever you want to call it. And so we struggled with that, and scientifically I think they're still exploring, and with carbon dating and new technologies and new ways of dating, trying to truly explain when these creatures were alive and where they were, and were humans there when they were there, and that kind of thing. So which you kind of talked about. Mm-hmm. But having a scientific mind that I do, there are a lot of things in the Bible that science doesn't explain, and so I've come to a point that I just have to give it to God and say,
I trust you.
I trust you. This, however it happened, you did it, and you're in control of my life and everybody's lives and what's happening here today, and just turn it over to Him and say, I don't know, but
you do.
It's good enough.
There you go. Yeah. Randy, what about you?
Well, I would say that a lot of, before getting on this journey, a lot of what he just stated was a hang up for me. But whether it's the creation story or the story of Noah or Jesus walking on water, all have their own implications for somebody really looking into this hard.
It's miraculous.
It's absolutely miraculous. However, there are a lot of parts of the individual stories that are not hard to explain at all that people get hung up on. For example, the argument that I'll hear a lot is, you're telling me that Noah fit 2 of every animal on the ark. And I said, no. And if you can show me where in the Bible it says that, I'll be glad to concede. But they don't. And they can't. Why? Because it says that he fit 2 of every kind. And when you break down the natural kinds that make all the animals we see today, there's not that many, and the average size of them is the size of a goat. And if you consider that the ark and its dimensions that we do get in the Bible was about a football field and a half in length. In fact, today cargo ships and some of the best battleships in history were built based on the dimensions of the ark because it did so well in the flood. So God in his engineering mind gave Noah the perfect plans, and all of these people that don't believe in God don't matter copywriting him.
Yeah.
Right? And today the reason why a cargo ship can be out in the middle of the ocean and completely just bob and weave and not flip over is because of that perfect design that was given to us. I don't have a problem mathematically with the animals. Now, how the animals all got there, well, depending on Pangea, and if you believe that this was all one landmass before it broke up in the flood, I mean, we all can do puzzles and clearly look at a flat map and go, yeah, if you move Africa a little bit closer, it actually all fits as one piece. So those were areas that I used to struggle with, that then when I did research and listened to minds much smarter than myself, I don't have the education that this guy has or his wife has, right? Right out of high school, I went straight to work. I was a young dad. And in fact, that's why when people probably heard in the congregation, he has a 25-year-old? Mm-hmm. It's like, yeah, I was a young dad. So I went straight to work.
So you've had to learn this on your own.
All of this, 100% on my own. And it took 5 years just focusing on apologetics, whereas, I'm sure 4 to 6 years, and they had many different. So in 5 years, this is all I've focused on and all I've studied. And so I guess that's a testament to somebody going, well, I'm just, a country bumpkin or whatever, and I just went to high school and that's it. I'm an example of somebody that can do it as long as you're willing to put in the time.
Yeah, the resources are available. It's more about it just, are you willing to dive in?
Absolutely. And then ask a lot of questions, because I had to watch things 3 or 4 times to fully grasp what it is they were saying, because I didn't have the formal background, the formal education. And I had to confirm things with people way smarter than myself, so I didn't sound like an idiot repeating something that was like already proven wrong 50 years ago or something. And so
let me ask a different question, because I just asked, it's like, what is that one thing that just kind of you trip over? What about the other thing? Well, like what convinces you, like when you read the biblical account, that this is true? In other words, what are the things that kind of prop you up to say, God, Chris, for example, you said, I don't know about all this stuff, but God, I trust you. What is that one thing for you that kind of said, yeah, I'm going to trust you. You're trustworthy when you look at this stuff.
So you kind of touched about it in your talk, just the human body itself and the way that we have all of these different organs. And when you start off, we know how a human is formed in the womb. And you do start off as essentially a single cell that multiplies out and then turns into this. And that is just, there is no way that just happens, right? So to me, that is science proving that there's somebody designing this and somebody is in control. And so that to me is the trump card. I mean, how does this just happen?
Good answer, yeah. Randy, what about you?
For me, it actually is biblical. It is the fact that you have these disciples who, I guess the question has been asked in the past, would you die for something you know is a lie?
Yeah.
Right? So you look at the scriptures and you see all these men that, like today we talked about Peter and how he was hung, and in fact requested to be hung upside down so that he wouldn't be killed the same way as his Savior.
He wasn't worthy of it. Yeah.
That he wasn't worthy. I'm sorry. I'm a fireman. I run into burning buildings all the time, and I am willing to give up my life. But if someone said, for sure you're going to die when you go in there, I'd give a couple seconds to think about it, to be honest with you.
Yeah, what is it?
That's just my human nature.
11 of the 12 disciples all died alone and for the faith.
Really badly, too.
Yeah,
if you look it up, I mean, we touched a little bit on the fact that some of them were boiled in oil, drawn and quartered. If you don't know what that is, don't look it up. It's really bad deaths, and they knew it was coming, yet they had so much faith, and they knew, they were eyewitnesses, that they knew, this is going to hurt, but I know where I'm headed.
It's worth it.
I know where I'm headed.
Yeah.
And that alone right there, I would say that was what brought me to faith originally, before any of this apologetic stuff came about, was the eyewitness accounts of Christ being alive outside the tomb, and him showing himself to 500 over 40 days, and then his disciples continue to do his work when he left, and to die knowing that all I had to say was, I just made it up. I'll just, And J. Warner Wallace does a great job arguing that position when it comes. He's a former homicide detective in Torrance, California, who's an apologist now, who was an atheist. And he came to know the Lord because he applied the principles of homicide investigation to the story of Christ, and came to his conclusion that there's no way these guys made that up. Like, they believed 100% of what they said to the point of death.
Right.
So,
not a mass hallucination, not a good lie.
And he breaks all of those down as to, was it this, was it that? No, because da-da-da-da-da. And he gives reasonable, that's what seems to be the topic of this whole conversation, is reasonable, right? Yeah. There's even a book out there called Reasonable Faith, and it talks about how what we believe is very reasonable, but if we try to only put God in a human reason box, then we're always going to be perplexed.
He's not going to fit there, not ever. Yeah.
But if we allow God to be God, then we have to allow for there to be a certain measure of, I just don't know. And God knew that we would come to that conclusion because he even gave us word for it, like we talked about earlier in Deuteronomy. So,
all right, well, gentlemen, great conversation today. Thanks for making your time to come and ask these questions. I guess for anybody who's listening, we'll continue these kind of questions. So if anybody's wants to ask more questions, and just because we had this doesn't mean that we can't get answers to people who have it. So myproblemwithgod.com for questions that people want to submit. Chris, Randy, thank you guys for taking your time out. And
absolutely.
Thanks for having us.
All right, see you later.
Praise God.